At the beginning of this year, there were a few memoirs bouncing around in my mind that I knew I wanted to reread from different periods of my life, and I decided to make that a full project. I reread 5 memoirs that still have a hold on me, and then I read 5 new ones. And if you take nothing else from this video, please do go reread a book that you've loved, because it shouldn't have to take a project to do something nice for yourself. If you haven't watched my videos before, my name is Jennifer, and you're gonna get a really good sense of my reading taste from these 10 books. You're gonna get a sense of some of my preferred time periods and topics, and definitely of my preferred region. I'm going to start with the oldest book on the list and then go directly to the newest. So we begin with a Victorian memoir, although obviously the tradition of autobiographical writing stretches back much further than the 19th century, so any recommendations you have for older autobiographies are very welcome. This is the autobiography of Margaret Oliphant, the Victorian novelist, and God, it's one of the more sorrowful lives I can remember reading about. I think this is an overlooked little gem of a book, but it is a gut punch, and you have to know that going in. First, her husband died, leaving her abroad with their 3 young children. Then her daughter died at age 10 in Rome as well. And ultimately, her older son died at age 34 and her younger at 33. She writes profoundly about each instance of grief, especially about losing her children. And in the earlier cases, she exhorts herself to bear it and to keep moving forward and to believe that God is calling her loved ones to him. But she also allows her pen to express the fullness of her feelings and the sense of unfairness. So there's that push and pull. And then in the later cases of loss, when she's writing in their aftermath, it's like there's an abyss and she can no longer trust in the narrative sense of her life. But the story here isn't just a series of losses, it's also a story of a lifetime of financially supporting men who couldn't support themselves. Oliphant's mother was the more dependable of her parents, and she ran the household, and Oliphant followed in her footsteps and in various ways was failed by her father, her brothers, and her sons. She writes, for the most part, with such warmth and with really fond recollections of her sons, but she also acknowledges that they were disappointments to her. They didn't avail themselves of their opportunities. They weren't hard workers. They were never able to stand on their own feet. Oliphant, on the other hand, was remarkably capable and industrious and kept her whole family afloat. As a widow, she paid for her brother and his children and her own children through her writing. She wrote dozens of novels, poetry, literary criticism, essays, articles. She says in the autobiography that she never turned down an assignment. And this leads to another fascinating element of the book, which is her ambivalent relationship with her own talent, especially as compared to the talents of some of her contemporaries like Charlotte Bronte and George Eliot. She mentions them, she writes about them in this book, and she has appreciation for their work. There are some witty asides, some jealousy, for sure. And the thing is, she can't quite decide how fair it is to blame the quality of her literary output on her unfortunate circumstances. There are times when she seems to think that maybe if she had been cared for in the way that George Eliot was, she might have had the time and energy to craft a masterpiece. But then there are other times when she seems to say, no, I was just never a true artist, and I never would have been anyway. What I'll say is that this was my first encounter with her writing, and she has a wonderful turn of phrase, and there are astute and dry observations about others in here. I think she's a clever writer, but not self-consciously so. But you have to know what you're getting into with this one. When she began writing this autobiography, she didn't expect it to become an autobiography of grief, but that is in large part what it became, and I think it's hugely powerful. Now we move to the newest book on the list. It was published this year in 2025. It's Memorial Days by Geraldine Brooks. Brooks is an author I appreciate because I really enjoy her writing, and I also really like recommending her to my family and friends who don't read very much. A lot of you will know her historical fiction novels like People of the Book and Year of Wonders and March, which is my favorite of hers. This memoir is about her husband's sudden heart attack and death at age 60 in 2019, and how in 2022, she traveled to a remote island off the coast of Tasmania where she'd had a significant trip as a young person, and where she now knew she wouldn't be able to distract herself. She would have to think about him and their life together and his death. And what you get here is a portrait of a lovely marriage, which is just so nice. I mean, my parents have marriage like that, and it's not the kind that you see represented in books all that often. Brooks and her husband were just emotionally intelligent, and lucky enough to grow together as they grew older. But that means she struggles a lot with two basic facts. The first is that she was so lucky in love. She had beautiful, meaningful years with a true partner. And the second fact is that they thought they'd have more quality years together. They'd recently become empty nesters. They had plans for their 60s and 70s, and she feels robbed of that chapter. In thinking back on their shared life together, there are a few really interesting dynamics. One of them is that Brooks is Australian and her husband was American, and some of you will be more familiar with him actually because he was a writer too, Tony Horwitz, whose most famous book I think is Confederates in the Attic. And Brooks found living in America to be a serious culture shock. She would have preferred raising their children in Australia, but American culture was essential to Tony's writing, and she also knew that she would be more successful as a transplant than he would. And then, of course, there's the element of them both being first foreign correspondents and then authors, and there's such a specific kind of intimacy to Brooks describing how he would edit her writing. And if this is making you think of parallels with Joan Didion's memoir, The Year of Magical Thinking, I'll say that there's an absolutely delightful and surprising cameo of The Year of Magical Thinking in this book. Overall, this is a memoir that tracks the logistics of a surprise death, how much there is to do, how overwhelming it all is, how the administration of death can make it hard for you to stop and grieve. And at the end, we learn more about the causes of Tony's heart attack from the results of his autopsy in a way that subtly reframes a lot of the details she'd already given you. Just top to bottom, I found Brooks to be so clear and perceptive and moving about their shared time and the life she didn't plan for now. Jumping back in time again because the next section is on 3 great 20th century memoirs. I had to have a World War I memoir here, and in the English-speaking world, this is one of the big ones. It's Goodbye to All That by Robert Graves. It was originally published in 1929, and he heavily revised it in 1957, and that's the version I read. But this mostly follows his early years at one of those dreadfully elite English boarding schools for boys, and then we also follow his years fighting in the First World War. I'll talk more about the role of emotion in this book in a minute, but to start, I'll say that his misery is more evident when he talks about his time in school than when he talks about the war. He says, "From my first moment at Charterhouse, I suffered an oppression of spirit that I hesitate to recall in its full intensity, and that was partly because his mother's family was German, which of course would only become more significant in 1914. He was 19 when the war began that year, and one of the many interesting things is that he was never a blindly devoted British patriot. But still, from his vantage point writing this years later, you can sense that he has this clear attachment to certain elements of British Army traditions, to the history of his specific regiment, for example, and also to the arms drill that they used to maintain their unit's preparedness for battle. He doesn't have illusions about how the war progressed, but he also isn't presenting things as, look how naive we all were to think you could be brave in the face of machine guns. He believes in bravery, which for him is almost synonymous with discipline and self-control in these conditions. One of the most memorable lines for me is when he says, "Trench fate seemed to be almost entirely a matter of morale," by which he means that the disciplined battalions suffered from this condition a lot less than the undisciplined ones. It was just the morale, you guys. What a specific worldview, really. The book jacket copy calls this vivid and harrowing, and it definitely is vivid, but it's not written with the intent of being harrowing. Graves is maddeningly matter-of-fact. He's graphic at times in his descriptions of trench conditions and corpses, executions, snipers, that kind of thing. And he's open, too, about battle plans and the instructions he was given and how everything went wrong at times. But that's just because that's how it was. That's why he's reporting on it in that way. And really, regardless of the content, the tone stays consistent. There's something about Graves's approach that made me pause to consider the contemporary relationship between memories and feelings. We often recount memories through the prism of how they made us feel. That's how I told the story of my unemployment in the video before this one. That's how Brooks recounts the story of the call about her husband's death. One of the main elements of that section is how the doctor's manner made her feel. So much of 21st century memoir writing revolves around emotions, whether they're stated or implied. And actually, they're the roadmap to many a story in general. So when somebody tells tells you an anecdote about not being picked for a sports team when they were younger in school, the listener is processing that as a story about loneliness to the extent that the emotion that came from the experience almost overlays and overwrites the experience itself. And I mean this as a neutral observation. I'm not saying that we're all pansies for being able to feel our feelings. There's strength in that too, and it's a lot more nuanced in general. What I'm getting at here is that something felt different psychologically about Graves' memoir writing in a fundamental way. He mentions his emotions. He'll say that he felt empty and lost after a friend's death. He describes his symptoms of shell shock. But when he tells a story about the war, it's not meant to be a story about fear or about loss. The details of the event are the primary thing for him, and something like loss is secondary. I have my own speculations as to why that might be. Factors personal to Robert Graves, British cultural factors. There's some repression here, definitely, but that's not the entirety of what's going on, because you also have the development of psychology as its own self-proclaimed field in the decades leading up to World War I, and the continued cultural digestion of the series of Freud and Jung and Adler. And then there's also the fact that trauma studies as a field really only emerged after the Second World War. The point here is that this event-centric attitude is a notable element of the book, and I found it illuminating. I have a plan to do a roundup in January of all the World War I books I've read this year, so I'll be talking about goodbye to all that again and giving some advice for reading it. So if you have questions about it, I can address those in that video. You can leave them in the comments. But for now, let's move on to another 20th century memoir from a different literary tradition, in this case, the Czech literary tradition. I had to mention How I Came to Know Fish by Ota Pavel, translated from Czech by Jindřiška Badal and Robert McDowell. I loved the experience of this reread, and I couldn't believe how much I'd forgotten because it's short. It's only 130 pages. Like, how much can I forget even of 130 pages, right? But I don't know, it's just brimming with such unassuming care and meaning. It's funny, sometimes when I go to talk about this book and I try to describe it to somebody else, I suddenly feel like I could cry. I guess it's just nestled a little closer to my heart than a lot of other books. It was first published in 1974, the year after he died, actually. Pavel was born in 1930 and grew up in a small Bohemian town. He was the youngest of 3 brothers, and their mother was Czech Christian while their father was Czech Jewish. To put it simply, this memoir is about some of the most memorable experiences he had fishing as a boy, about who taught him how to fish, his connection to those people, and his connection to nature. I think if you're the type whose mind is quieter when you're in nature and who needs to seek nature out to feel like you're balanced in the world, then you'll recognize how sensitively Pavel captures that quality. And then the family stories are kind of zany and a joy to read. But if you heard the birth year 1930 and you did the Central European math, then you've already realized that Pavel was a boy when World War II began. And he writes about that as well. He writes about his brothers and his father being imprisoned by the Nazis, about the occupation of his town, and about another very dangerous story of fishing. This is the type of book that makes me feel so grateful that I'll read anything if it's Czech, that I don't really have a comfort zone to speak of in that respect, because I never would have picked it up even based on my own description I just gave, really. And I think there are so many of you who would feel the subtle emotional wallop of this book, even if you're like me and haven't spent a single second of your life caring about fishing. It's a memoir that makes you feel how precarious and lovely it is to have small things in your life that are precious to you, and how special the small stories of your family are, those quiet stories about the people who've mentored us and the places that have meant something to us. Pavel wrote this book while he was recovering from an acute psychiatric breakdown, which he discusses very briefly at the end. So you know this is somebody who was writing at his lowest ebb and wanted to remind himself that life had been meaningful and that maybe it could be again. The next book is the reason this video exists, because I first read it when I was 16. It was like nothing I'd ever read before structurally. I was completely out of my depth, and I wanted to have a specific reason to reread it. This is Maxine Kingston's modern classic, The Woman Warrior. Very loosely, this is a memoir told in 5 sections where each section grapples with the many faces and voices and contradictions of Chinese and Chinese American womanhood. At the time it was published in 1976, it was incredibly successful and a major point of contention among certain Chinese American scholars and artists. And from the beginning, the publisher, critics, booksellers, and Kingston herself debated whether to call it fiction or nonfiction. But it was Kingston who included the word memoir in the subtitle, Memoir of a Girlhood Among Ghosts. And the thrill of this shifting and darting form of autobiography is the very personal artistry of it. The way each of the 5 sections feels like its own complete experience and like it's in conversation with all the others. And the way Kingston fuses Chinese folktales and poetry and fragments of family history with her own American and Californian sensibilities. There are these urgent questions for young Maxine and the Maxine who was writing this that run throughout the stories, and I think that's clearest in the first one. It's called No Name Woman. It's only about 10 pages long, and it opens with her mother telling young Maxine a story of an aunt on her father's side who became pregnant by someone who was not her husband. And this is meant to be a cautionary tale because Maxine has started menstruating. And her mother always told her never to mention this no-name aunt to her father or to anyone else. So we begin with an act of storytelling, but there's no whimsy to it at all. It's for a practical purpose. It's meant to warn and to silence. And because it's a story with such limited details and so many silences by design, Kingston instinctively fills in the gaps, and the rest of the chapter is her imagining the things that her aunt might have experienced and might have felt. And it's a really elegant way of confronting the fact that storytelling never can bridge a gap with reality. Storytelling is a bridge that will always end before it touches the opposite shore. So even as Kingston is thinking through these events that are so much bigger and broader than she is, she's consistently coming up against the limits of what she knows. From this first chapter onwards, she emphasizes her distant and incomplete relationship with the Chinese culture of her parents, who were already adults and had lived full lives when they came to the US. So there's always this lurking sense that she's not completely sure if these are her stories to tell, but they are her stories in some way, and they've impacted her, and others haven't told them to her fully. So her mind wants to understand and create and connect from there. A lot of the concern about this book in the 70s and 80s came from Chinese figures who feared, fairly so I would imagine, that it would be interpreted by a majority white audience as some kind of definitive representation of Chinese culture writ large, which it isn't. I mean, even the classically inspired folktales have Kingston's embroidery all over them. But the scholarship I've read from the decades since has done a lot to reclaim this as a literary work, and it is such an experience. This memoir is unusually innovative and lyrical and memorable. The next 2 memoirs are both tales about the end of socialism in Central and Eastern Europe at the end of the 20th century. Some of you will have seen this next book on my channel when it was published in 2021. It's called Free, A Child and a Country at the End of History by Leah Uppy. I love my hardcover of this, but I have to say I might like the paperback even more. This is a book of 2 halves. The first is Uppy's account of her childhood in Albania before the fall of socialism, and the second half is about that post-socialist rupture and awakening and the loss of the stories of her childhood and of the country that she thought would shape the rest of her life. I can't tell you how unlikely the success of this book was. It's an uphill battle to get Anglophone readers to care about the Czech Republic and Poland. It's like scaling a vertical cliff face to get them to care about Albania. If I were to walk into a publishing house right now and say, so one of my clients is writing a memoir about her childhood in Albania, as soon as the word Albania exited my mouth, the force of their disinterest alone would propel me right back onto the street. This kind of thing doesn't happen. This kind of book doesn't take off. But it did, and I think that's because it's a great read, and that one person after another has recommended it to someone else. Uppy is a professor of political theory at the London School of Economics, and she's interested in theories of freedom, in how different political and economic systems conceive of freedom, and in how different people do. So she uses her grandmother, mother, and father as three characters with very different conceptions of that word, and those people and their worldviews are so vivid. And of course you have the overarching characters of socialism and capitalism, and you follow Upi's transformation from a child with blind belief to a teenager and an adult who's an inherent skeptic. And that's not just because of the great lies of socialism as they're revealed in the second half of the book. She's skeptical also because the promises of capitalism don't come through in some truly desperate ways. And she sees how any failures of capitalism in the 90s and early 2000s in Albania are blamed on the supposed backwardness of her society. Albanians are treated like they failed at socialism and capitalism, and never like anything about those systems failed them. After my first reading of this, it was the early sections that I remembered the most clearly, the sections where she drops hints about all the things she didn't understand as a child, and whose truths she then reveals narratively after the fall of socialism when her parents and grandmother could reveal them to her. This time, though, I was also struck by her descriptions of her teenage years when there are such momentous things happening in her country and within her own family, but she is still fixated on her own teenage-coded problems at different times, and I guess that's just a shared experience the world over. This is such a good book. It's probing, it's engrossing, it happens to be a quick read too, and Upi has a second book coming out this week. I think the first week of September is when I'm going to post this. It's called Indignity, and it's about her grandmother's life, which feels like such a natural progression based on how central and beloved her grandmother is in this book. The second memoir of this pair shares a lot of those qualities of Free, but it's also a little more unconventional, I think. And if you're a German speaker, there's a good chance you're already familiar with this one, at least in passing. It's Jana Hensel's After the Wall, Confessions from an East German Childhood and the Life That Came Next, translated from German by Jefferson Chase. The original title of this is Sonnenkinder, and when it was originally published in 2002, it was a big bestseller, earned a lot of coverage, and inspired a lot of discussions. As you can guess from the title, this is Hensel's account of her childhood in the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, up until the time she was 13 when the Berlin Wall fell and Germany as we now know it was reunited as a country. And she remembers the massive protests that were happening in the fall of 1989 in her home city of Leipzig. What's so special and so specific about this is she frames everything as though she's a traveler, as though she's someone who's traveling to the past, someone who's trying to tell her own childhood stories on her own terms, and not in the way that people of her generation have gotten used to telling their stories through West German eyes and within a West German framework. So she talks about the cartoons and the after-school activities and the summer vacations and the military drills of her youth. But as she does so, she's dispelling myths created by both outsiders and by other East Germans. One of the funniest moments is when she talks about this idea that East Germany was so much more communal because you could just stop by another person's house unannounced. And she's like, yeah, because most of us didn't have landlines. We didn't have a choice. If you wanted to chat with someone, you had to invade their privacy. And she goes on to say that she actually prefers things the way they are now, where she can choose to call someone first before barging in on them. A noteworthy characteristic of After the Wall is how Hensel uses the word we, how often she frames things collectively from the perspective of her generation, which was the generation that was old enough to have had a full childhood in the German Democratic Republic for the most part, but then also young enough to fully adapt to this new world in this new Germany, as opposed to the generation of their parents who felt in many ways like their shared experiences and values and possibilities evaporated overnight and found it a lot more difficult to adapt. The narrative of we did this is how we were taught, this is how our lives changed, is important structurally and philosophically too, because Hensel is attempting something paradoxical here. She wants to treat her generation's experiences like they're those of a dominant culture, because she's tired of having to explain everything to outsiders. She wants to create this space where her generation of East Germans can share their memories without treating them like they're this bizarre and doomed footnote in history. But at the same time, she is still thinking about outsiders, inevitably, and explaining certain things the way an anthropologist would, and not in the way that someone from a dominant culture would ever have to, you know? Telling it like it was is a seemingly simple project, but in a case like this, when you have to be a time traveler of sorts to return to a disappeared past, just representing things how they actually were and not how they have come to be represented is a project that has so many cultural and personal obstacles. I don't know if I've ever mentioned this book on the channel because I read it about 12 years ago now and I loved it as a reread. It's a deceptively sophisticated book with a lot of deeply embedded philosophical questions, and it's also written clearly and even simply on the line level. I think that a lot of you would fly through this and would really enjoy it. These next two are war memoirs, but unlike the Robert Graves, they're from the perspective of civilians, and they're also stories from East Central Europe. The first of those was another reread. It's A Little Annihilation by Anna Janko, translated from Polish by Philip Boehm. And wow, this was a lot more intense and more graphic than I'd remembered it. I definitely softened it in my memory, and I guess I can't blame my brain for trying to do me that kindness. Janko is interested in both the concept and the lived experience of inherited trauma, and that's because when her mother was a child in rural Poland, her whole village was wiped out by the Nazis, including both her parents. And I realize in saying that I'm creating a kind of distance that Janko herself tries to avoid creating. She does this not because she's trying to go for shock and awe, it's because she's invested in the details of this last day in the village of Soche. She reconstructs the stages of the murders and the destruction from different eyewitness accounts, and in the memoir she keeps returning to this day to add more details, like we eventually learn that Janko's mother watched her own mother be killed by being shot in the mouth. And yeah, it's details like that that grab a hold of you and that you can tell still have Janko in their grip after all these years of her thinking about them. It was interesting to read this so close to The Woman Warrior because, like I said, Kingston is open and also artful about her own distance from some of her subject matter, and Janko has the opposite approach. Even though the foundation is her mother's experiences, she's not questioning if this is her story to tell. A lot of the book is structured like a mother-daughter dialogue, but she is comfortable being the primary narrator. She says, "I've thought about the war for as long as I can remember. I've lived within its context since childhood. I ate because later there might be hunger." In Regarding the Pain of Others, Susan Sontag has this passage where she claims it is intolerable to have one's suffering twinned with anybody else's. And again, Janko has a different attitude. She doesn't limit this to her mother's suffering or to that of the village of Soche. She feels this gravitational pull almost to other cases of suffering from the Second World War and beyond. She becomes absorbed in one case study after another, and the breadth of that comparative style means she doesn't really arrive at a specific theory of evil. It's more that she wants to mark the passage of evil, and in doing that, she naturally twins her mother's suffering with that of many others. For me, I did question her approach at times, and that was a lot more true on this second reading, but more generally, I'm just drawn to the workings of her mind, to watching a mind that's gnawing on a topic, gnawing down to the marrow of it. This second civilian war memoir is told on a smaller canvas than A Little Annihilation, and it's more intimate for that. It's called The Loss, the Story of a Dead Soldier Told by His Sister, and it's by Olesya Khromeychuk. She's a Ukrainian historian, and in 2017 her older brother died on the front lines fighting Russians and Russian separatists in eastern Ukraine, and that's why you might have heard me use the phrase full-scale invasion to describe February of 2022, because there's been a war since 2014. And because Khromeychuk published this in 2021, it's an interesting time capsule of some of the rhetoric and attitudes about the war before the full-scale invasion. She and her two brothers grew up in Lviv in western Ukraine, and all three of them ended up abroad, Khromeychuk in the UK, and initially her oldest brother lived and worked in the Netherlands. But of the three, he was the one who returned to Lviv. So a year into the war, in 2014, he voluntarily enlisted, and then 2 years later he was killed in combat. Khromeychuk isn't a sugarcoater, and I really like that. She has a historian's comfort with snags and otherwise smooth narratives, and you can see that just from the way she begins talking about her relationship with her brother, which wasn't a simple one, and she doesn't try to make it one in retrospect. I found it really moving, actually, to see her talk about the snags in that relationship, about how he was 9 years older than she was, and they had such different personalities and ways of expressing themselves. And also, she knew in that little sister way that she felt a kind of awe for him that he likely didn't feel for her. But this memoir is such a good example of the fact that you don't necessarily have to be euphemistic or evasive to also be respectful of the stories of others. We get these flashes of Volodya, of his talents and of his struggles, but there's a lot that she can't piece together about him, and she doesn't pretend to. It's an expression of love without ownership. So there are these two major threads running throughout what's a really economical book. There's a lot going on in 120 pages. There's the thread of her worry and then her grief for her brother. And then there's another thread of ambivalence towards the war itself and towards the idealization of heroic combat deaths. I want to give you a passage of that where she's talking to a stranger at a gravesite, and the stranger speaks first. "You see, people just don't understand why anyone would want to leave their comfortable lives abroad and go to the front line. I tell them it's because of patriotism, but they just don't get it." I chose not to tell her that she didn't get it either. That my brother didn't swap a comfortable life for the trenches, that life abroad can also be uncomfortable, that patriotism isn't the only thing that drives people to go to war, and that one can be patriotic without going to the front. You see there both her sharp analytical mind and her unease with a lot of the interactions after his death. And she feels a sudden unease with her own profession too, with writing and teaching about the history of war. Like with Brooks's memoir, this one is focused on the bureaucratic work following a death, and also on these small moments that are so evocative of loss. It's not often that I've encountered war from this perspective. You hear from soldiers and from mothers of soldiers, from wives, from lovers, but a sister's story isn't one that's told that often, and Khromeychuk's book feels like a kind of gift in that way. We're ending with what I think is the best written book on this list. It's Hilary Mantel's memoir, Giving Up the Ghost. It was another reread, and I've never taken a memoir writing class, but I would imagine that this is frequently taught in that kind of setting because of the strength of her technique, the seamlessness of it. I was looking for seams and couldn't find them. I have a little pocket edition of this one. This is her memoir of her childhood in northern rural England. To start, she was born in 1952, so we're talking about the immediate post-war period, and she was raised Catholic, which is sure to give someone a somewhat unhinged relationship to the self. Ask me how I know. There are two competing sensibilities here, because anyone who grows up poor on the moors is going to have this innate and morally neutral sense of what's unforgiving and pitiless in the world. At one point, she describes misfortune striking her grandmother's family regularly, like the strike of the clock. But Catholicism rejects that kind of neutrality. So as a child, she also intuits that there is evil in the world, that there are these lingering, sometimes malignant essences on certain streets and in homes and gardens. And one of the major events of her childhood involves an encounter with evil in a garden. One of the things I like most about this is Mantel's impersonal curiosity about her personal childhood psychology. She's careful and exploratory and often so funny, but funny in a startling way because it's like she's unearthing a world of experience that I'd forgotten I had. One example that comes to mind is when she describes thinking that her friend's father was a plant man because of the veins in his arms, and how adults would laugh at her for running away from him. But she knew what she knew. This is how she describes her perspective as a memoirist. "I can't make sense of childhood. I can only report it as it felt, minute by minute. I don't understand the terrain anymore, but I can walk it or trace it on a map." And it doesn't feel like she's retracing her childhood for the purposes of arriving at certain conclusions about her adulthood, although we do get patches of her early adulthood in this book, and that includes discussions of her years suffering from undiagnosed endometriosis and her hysterectomy at a young age, which left her with a few more of the ghosts that populate the book. Giving Up the Ghost for me is a really clear example of command and finesse. It made me think of those side-by-side Les Mis comparisons of Russell Crowe and Philip Boehm. It's one of those case studies for me of subjectivity versus objectivity of art quality, because Crowe has a nice voice. I mean, I didn't know he could sing that well, but there's an obvious difference there, and the difference is Quast can do anything with his voice. And that's what it's like to read Mantel's writing. I would argue especially in this memoir. You can just sense that she can do anything on the page. That's it for today. I've tried to keep everything as brief as I reasonably could, so that's what I'll say for now about these 10 Chef's Kiss memoirs. A lot of things haven't gone to plan this summer. You might have guessed that if you do follow the course of my videos and you saw that I was posting this one in the first week of September. This is the third and final video of my truncated summer 2025 season. I need to pack it in and regroup. But I'll be back a little later in the fall with more videos to share. I had such a good time today. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you then.